Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I'm really excited to introduce my guest here, who it's his second time in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I love a repeat guest. So make sure you listen to his other episode. And to reveal who it is, I'm joined with just a wonderful creative soul, Aaron Hamburger. You might have known him from his story collection called The View from Stalin's Head. It was awarded the Rome Prize by the American Academy of Arts and Letters and nominated for a Violet Quill Award. He's also written three novels. One we're going to talk about in depth, but Faith for Beginners, which was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award. Nirvana is Here, which won the bronze medal in 2019, the Forward Reviews Indies Book Awards. That's the podcast episode you need to listen to. And Hotel Cuba, which recently in 2023 was just awarded the Lambda Literary with the Jim Duggins PhD Outstanding Mid-Career Novelist Prize. Okay. And he's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Village Voice, the Chicago Tribune, and I could continue on. But I hope everyone, Aaron, listens to your first episode with us because I went through the depth of your career. But now I think we can just jump right in. What do you think,
Yeah,
Aaron?
let's do it. Yeah,
Okay, well,
totally.
it's so nice for you to be back here.
I'm thrilled to be back. Thanks for having me.
So I was just saying to Aaron before we went live that I really just love how much you've been on the road with Hotel Cuba. And it seems like it's a different media approach than Nirvana is here. Or, how do you balance maybe how Nirvana is here was received compared to Hotel Cuba as a starting question?
Yeah, it's interesting that this book has really been reaching, I think, the people who are fans of Nirvana is Here, but also people who weren't aware of that book and are interested in the Jewish family immigration story that is part of Hotel Cuba. It was funny. I was talking with a friend of mine, and I was like, I think Hotel Cuba is like, it's got this Jewish family story, but it's also a queer book. And my friend was like, oh yeah, it's a very queer book. And I'm like, yes, it is a very queer book, but it has both. And what I like is that there was a time in which if you addressed Jewish content and queer content, that you are perceived as only appealing to people who are both queer and Jewish. But now I think we live in a time where if you address queer content and Jewish content, you can appeal to both readers who are interested in queer subjects and readers who are interested in Jewish subjects. So it's additive rather than sort of, I don't know what the word is, but like reductive, which I think it was that way 20 years ago. So that's been really exciting. So, there's been press that's been in like the gay press about this book, and then there's also been press in the Jewish press, and I've done events, like at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City related to this book, and then also, just got to, geek out with like, gay book clubs and Jewish book clubs and really everybody. So, and it's interesting as the book has come out, so many people have said to me, "Oh, I have a family story too," and like I wish I'd written it down. Everybody can relate to it, I think, because everybody has that kind of family story, and very many of us who live in America have that coming to America story. And I think one of the things that the book brings to light is how particular those stories are, and also how modern in a certain way that they are. So when I was investigating this story, I mean, I think I was inspired by finding a photograph of my grandmother in full male drag in 1922. And I started to investigate, well, why was she wearing that? And what were the circumstances around that? And I was amazed by how often queerness kept coming up when I wasn't looking for it. It just was part of the times. And so, I think that's particularly interesting these days when there's all this debate about wokeness and, we're changing our, view of the past to fit contemporary values. It's like, no, 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 no. These things were always here. It's just that our eyes were not always open to them. So, I was delighted that I could tell this story that was, both in that mold of the traditional sort of like Jewish immigration story, but also with this more contemporary spin where we can, look at it with eyes open and see the variety of people that were there and the variety of feelings and experiences that they had.
Well, and to bring up an analogous literary comparison, Angels in America with Tony Kushner. I'm not sure how many have brought this up when you're doing all of your um, lectures and discussions, but I just remember vividly in Angels in America, Tony Kushner has that moment when it's the whole generational Jewish story that's being told. Actually, that's the beginning, is the rabbi opens up the play. And I think, like you're saying, though, there's such a long history of queer Jewish characters. I mean, Call Me by Your Name, even Andre Osman, all the characters are Jewish.
Mhm.
Um, and the queerness is really spelled out. But maybe Ari Silverman in Nirvana is here. That whole Me Too complexity with his ex-husband. I'm not trying to paint the picture that because of that sexual harassment, it turned off certain readers, but I think it is a different vein, like you're saying, than two sisters in Hotel Cuba who have this immigration story of trying to get into America and then they get blocked because of anti-immigration laws and have to, right, settling in Cuba, you don't hear that narrative a lot, but there's such like you bring to bear
Mhm.
Cuba, Brazil. I'm thinking of Clarice Lispector being a Jewish writer in Brazil, and I think even in the Evita musical, they touch upon Jewish immigrants in Argentina. So,
Mhm.
right, that whole South America journey. So it's such an interesting narrative, and for those who are hearing you, they're just really it's resonating those immigration
Yeah.
narratives.
And and queerness and the shtetl is like uh, not at all like antithetical. So, how many of your listeners have heard of Yentl? You know, which is based on an Isaac Bashevis singer story, became a Barbara Streisand movie, but about a girl who cross dresses as a boy so
Mhm.
that she can study in religious school. And Isaac Bashevis singer also wrote a story about a gay couple that runs away from two men. They leave their wives and they go to the big city and move there together so that they can live together as a married couple. And one of them actually dresses and lives as a woman and is the wife in the couple, and the other one is the male identified half of that couple. And this is a story that was written in the 70s by a Yiddish American writer. I mean, this stuff was definitely around and in the zeitgeist. It's interesting. You're talking about Argentina and Jewish immigration there. Um, you know, One of the untold stories about Jewish immigration across the Atlantic, we always think of the Ellis Island story. And indeed,
Mhm.
my grandfather experienced that. He came from Eastern Europe, got in through Ellis Island. He was actually one of the last people who got into Ellis Island before the immigration laws changed in 1921. But then, the United States, they were afraid of infiltration by Jewish communists, when in fact the Jews who were coming from the Soviet Union were fleeing communism. I mean, it's just so ironic. So they created these laws to keep them out. And the steamboat companies were losing so much money because they were making all this money from immigrants paying their passage to the United States.
Mhm.
So they said to the immigrants, hey, why don't you go to Cuba? Why don't you go to Mexico? Why don't you go to Argentina? And so those became big places where immigrants would go instead of the United States. And originally in the law that was passed in 1921, there's a carve out that says if you can establish residency in Cuba, Central America, South America for 1 year, you can then get into the United States and you will not be subject to these quotas. So a lot
Mm.
of people followed that path. And what's interesting is as this book has come out, people have written to me and come up to me and said, oh my God, like I also am like a descendant of immigrants who took that path. And so it's so interesting just to hear about this divergent path that people took. And what fascinated me about Havana in particular was that it was the center of alcohol tourism. So this was
Mm.
during the time of Prohibition, and you couldn't get drunk in the United States legally. And the hot song on the Billboard charts was I'll See You in Cuba by Irving Berlin, which was, the theme of it was, let's go to Cuba and get drunk because we can't get drunk in the United States. So all these American tourists are descending on Havana, doing alcohol tourism and engaging in every kind of debauchery that you can imagine. So live sex shows and, just think Mardi Gras on steroids. That's what it was like. So imagine like this young woman coming from a, very secluded shtetl in the middle of Russia, with winter and snow and then the mud of summer. And suddenly hot, sultry Havana and the debauchery and the drinking and everything that's going on and the clash of cultures and what that must have been like. And then, you were mentioning Me Too. The story has a Me Too element to it as well, because she is the victim of sexual violence, and it's a secret that she has to keep to herself, but is haunting her and hanging over her as she's trying to make her way through this very strange and exotic world to her.
Yeah, well, and I thank you for bringing up that liberatory aspect that you just so nicely lay out throughout the thematic element of your novel. And it's so interesting because a very New York Jewish immigrant tale on the stage, I think of is Guys and Dolls, which is set in the 1920s to 30s, um, sometime in between, but there's all these liquor laws, and then where do they go but Cuba and Havana? And like in the movie, that's where she's drinking out of the coconuts. And I mean, she's not
Mm-hmm.
Jewish, Sarah Brown, but
Mm-hmm.
um, there's that whole just the gambling. And I think of Atlantic City and Prohibition and Boardwalk Empire. And Irving Berlin actually vacationed in Atlantic City. So like when you brought up Irving Berlin, it was very like that's all part of this zeitgeist and part of the cultural explosion, the liberatory themes. Because, wouldn't you say how many, when you're talking about your book, Aaron, do they bring up ragtime? Or I feel like ragtime would be like E.L.
Mm,
Doctor's narrative. We always think of that turn of the century. We think of Fiddler on the Roof, which is turn of the
right,
century. It's
right.
always, I think there's even the musical Rags. It's always this turn of the century Jewish narrative of Ellis Island. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like Emma Lazarus even writing that poem, The New Colossus, for the statue, um,
Right.
is all right into the 1900s. But
Yeah.
the World War One aspect, right after World War One, I feel isn't really um, a cultural representation in our TV, films, musicals, novels. Um, so like, why was that so important? Because of your biography to look
Yeah.
into?
So, a couple of things. There was a huge surge in immigration that happened from about 1900 to 1920, which was in part why these new restrictive immigration laws came into force. But what's interesting to me is, first of all, how these laws shaped the debate about immigration going forward, even to today. I mean, even though the laws were changed in the 1960s from what they were in the 20s, they did govern the United States during World War II, when like all these refugees from Europe were trying to get away from the Nazis and come here and were turned away. And like it was on the basis of these laws that they were not admitted. And people, and also they created a kind of isolationist and anti-immigrant, or they solidified this anti-immigrant ethos into law, that we can still feel the effects of that in, as late as like 2017 with the Muslim ban. I mean, the way that these laws were structured in 1921, it was like, okay, we can't say no Jews in America, but what we can do is we can ban immigration from countries where the immigration is like 85% Jewish. What did Trump do in 2017? Same thing. We can't say no Muslims, but we can ban immigration or severely curtail it from these countries where it's pretty much like a Muslim population that's coming here. And that really was sort of the drive for me in writing this book. So I was with a group of there was a group of writers that met in DC in 2017 for the AWP convention. And it was right after the election, and people were fired up and they wanted to do stuff. And so a group formed to knock on the doors of every senator on Capitol Hill to advocate for progressive causes, and nobody took Michigan. I no longer live in Michigan, but I grew up there and I'm from there. So I said, okay, I'll take the Michigan one. So it was right around the time when I found this picture of my grandmother in full drag in 1922. She was an immigrant. She came by the path, via Cuba, as I mentioned. So I brought this picture with me to Capitol Hill, and here I was in the office of Senator Debbie Stabenow with all the professional lobbyists in their suits and their vinyl, their folders, and they're all professional, and there's like me, the dopey writer, and I'm in line with them, and then it's my turn, and I went in, to the office with the senator, and I said, hello, let me tell you the story of my grandmother. She immigrated to Michigan, years ago, and here's her story. And I want you to support the rights of immigrants today in her name. And the senator said, oh, I agree with you 100%. And I thought, boy, that's the easiest lobbying job I ever heard of. So I said, well, what can I do to support you? And she said, you're a writer. Tell your grandmother's story. Mm. And I hadn't really considered that. I, was just there to kind of advocate, for the causes I believed in. And, I was winding up. Nirvana is here at that point. I was sort of like casting about for like a new project. And I thought, well, I don't know. Let me see what happens. Let me just see for fun. Like, okay, well, she's on the ship. She's crossing the Atlantic. What was it like to be on the ship? Like, if people had to wash their hands, were there sinks? Did they have sinks on ships? And like, what was the room like? Where did they sleep? What were the beds like? What did it smell like? Who else was there? And so I started digging around, and I found like it was just so fascinating to me that I wanted to know more. So then I got her across the ocean. I got her to Cuba. And it's like, okay, well, when you land at Cuba, like what happens to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just got on this roll, and it just kept going. And here I was with a manuscript.
Well, and what did the senator say now that Hotel Cuba is out?
So I went back to her office, and she wasn't there at the time, but I dropped off a signed copy, and she mailed me a handwritten note to say thank you, and to tell me to keep writing. And I have to say, she has the most beautiful handwriting I've ever seen. I was very impressed by her handwriting.
Well, and you make no qualms about being progressive. And I know like you even share on your social media activist moments and marches. Um, and what I'm curious about though is because, your audience is large, which is wonderful. Like this book is so resonating. I was even saying to Aaron that I listened to his NPR interview, which is everyone out there after this, you should listen. It's 8 minutes. But have you had political, I don't want to call them opponents, but right, have you had those? I'm sure they range in a spectrum, especially Jewish Americans. They're not all progressive. Unlike, I think there's a stereotype that they're all Democrats, which is not true.
Right.
Because as we know, there's like the Republican Jewish voters for Israel, and I don't have to get into all that. But I'm not on here for you to debate Israel at all. But, have you had those of different political beliefs, but your story has just, it's universally registering for them?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I mean, I have people who answer to your description in my own family. But I wrote an article for Tablet Magazine, a nonfiction article about that was more overtly political, and I did get like an email from like a Trump voter, which was like completely incoherent. Like it was just like a grab bag of like word salad of various positions. There was nothing to say. So it was just like, God bless you, go on your way. But and listen, I don't say that my book is only for people who voted for one way or the other. It's a story, and I hope it engenders compassion for immigrants, on the part of anybody who's anywhere on the political spectrum, to get people to see, when you leave home, it's for a reason, and it's not an easy journey. Whatever you think we should do about immigrants, can we do it with more charity and less vitriol. Um, but yeah, I haven't had really any pushback that I'm aware of. Except once at one event, somebody said, I heard you were advocating for immigrants. Not everybody thinks that way. Not everybody thinks immigrants are so good. And I was like, oh, okay, well, but nobody has said it to my directly to my face. So maybe they will. I'm waiting for it.
Yeah, well, and the contemporary resonance of your narrative, especially I feel with social class, like, I always don't want to give it all away to everyone out there, but you make no, from the beginning, we know that this is a working class Jewish family, the sisters, like even describing the conditions of the boat journey and the shtetl that they came from. And eventually, like where they end up in Cuba, it's not that they're able to live a very upper middle class lifestyle right away. Or
Right.
even right at Ellis Island, I thought, because this is my own family's um, history and journey, but those from my mom and dad's side who came to Ellis Island was turn of the century. It was like 1900 to 1910. Um, Italian and maybe Sephardic on my dad's side. Still hard to tell, but um, definitely some kind of Middle Eastern Sephardic ancestry. But then my mom was Eastern European, Hungarian, and Czechoslovakian. And they had to have sponsors, right? Like you had to have someone to vouch for you usually
Yeah.
in America
Yeah.
already. Like that's how
Yeah.
it was with my parents' families. Then they had a place to live. And like it wasn't just you arrive at Ellis Island and they let you in right away.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you really bring to bear issues of social class, and I think that that's something even in our contemporary moment we're not talking openly about. Like we're talking more in binary ways of someone voted for that person or you vote for that person instead of a lot of changes in America right now. It is a immigration centered, and it's about what policies do we have on the table and how do we operate under empathy or, um, the immigrants who are here in America currently, they tend to be from a working class. Like it is related to social class. I mean, maybe I'm generalizing, but even what's happening right now in New York City with those who, um, are trying to get into hotels and then they're having to sleep outside. It's just mind-boggling to think this is where we are right now in our country.
Yeah, yeah. What's kind of fascinating to me, which I didn't know until I started digging into my story, is that so my both my grandparents came from the same village in Russia, and then when you read the book, you sort of see their story converge. So my grandmother and her family always thought they were like a little better than everybody else because they came from Lithuania,
Oh,
that
wow.
there was like even within this very sort of poor village that they were from, there were these social strata, and also she was the daughter of the cantor, and like yes, the cantor had to work as a butcher to make ends meet, during the week, but he was still the cantor, and so they were like a little better off than other people in their town. But then, once they get to Cuba, they're really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. And then we have recordings of my grandparents telling their immigration stories. And my grandmother says, when she eventually got to New York, she said, when I saw how my sisters were living in New York, I wanted to go back to Russia. So we all think of, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us probably think like, oh, the coming to America story is about they get to the promised land and then like everything is great. When in fact, like conditions on the Lower East Side were so awful, that, and by the way, conditions that immigrants live in today are often just as awful in different ways. That my grandmother would make this statement, and you have to realize for her to say that, Russia in the early 1920s was going through a time of intense violence and death and shooting and chaos and famine. And if you see the pictures from that period, people look like victims of the concentration camps. The emaciation is unbelievable. And there was cannibalism going on. I mean, they were starving, so that was quite a statement. It was not necessarily like the happy landing. My grandfather had a slightly different story. You were talking about sponsors. He was able to get to his family who lived in Detroit, and they had they had a place for him, and they were able to ease his transition. They were a little bit better off. But on my grandmother's side, it was not that way.
Well, I think that what we're seeing right now, the um vitriol that some Americans have towards immigrants is this
Yes.
fear-mongering rhetoric that you bring up in Hotel Cuba. Like, I
Well,
always think literature. No, yeah, go
can I
ahead.
just talk about that? So I went to the National Archives because I was looking for the people who worked in immigration at the time, and they had people on the ground in Cuba, and they were looking for people who were trying to get into the United States illegally from Cuba. And in fact, my grandmother paid an American couple to pretend she was their daughter, and they went to Key West, and then she got arrested immediately when she got to Key West. So I was looking at the records from this time, and I found like all these letters from everyday American citizens writing to report on undocumented immigrants. And they were saying, I'm doing this to protect the purity of the American blood pool. We don't want it to get like dirtied by these like terrible, like undocumented immigrants. And they're saying they're taking our jobs. They can't assimilate. They have different values. And it was amazing. All of their rhetoric was exactly the same as the rhetoric you hear today that's anti-immigrant. You just swap out the nationalities, but it's the same like kind of horrible rhetoric. So the fear is the same, and we just switch out the different who's in the in group, who's in the out group. You were mentioning like you come of Italian derivation. There was a time in this country when like Italians were like, oh, French were described as swarthy, dark toned skin. They were not white. French were not white. So the definition of whiteness like was very, very narrow. And now it's like, okay, we'll let the French people be white. We'll let the Italian people be white, but it wasn't always so. So these categories that we come up with that we think are so kind of stable. And so, oh yes, clearly these people belong. These people are Americans and these people are not. Well, go back in the history. You who are saying today, America for the Americans, you would not have been an American 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So just be careful, with your rhetoric there.
Yeah, well, and even in my now finished dissertation, which is nice to be on the other side, but I bring up there's queer scholars, especially Siobhan Somerville and Julian Carter. They talk about what you're saying, Aaron, which is how race studies or the category of race and whiteness and blackness and all of these categories we now just take for granted in America, categorization on census reports come out in the late Victorian period when sexuality comes out too. Like that
Mhm.
whiteness isn't about skin color when it's a category. It's about, like you're saying, who's the in group, like who
Right.
is, I mean, right. At first it was Protestant, it was the
Right. Catholics were on
Anglo-Saxon.
the outs. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Catholics were on the outs.
Yeah.
Even someone who was Protestant who wanted to marry a Catholic was seen as a sin. Or the Irish were really put under scrutiny. Like you're saying, the
Yes.
target always moves. It's like that, game at a carnival where you're trying to hit the target and it just keeps moving on the lever, and
That's a
it's
good
always
analogy.
out of reach. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I just came
Yeah.
back from Atlantic City, so that's why
Oh,
it's on my head,
yeah.
in my head right now. But I played a lot of arcade games. So I think though what's just really interesting though, especially maybe I'm getting this um pace wrong with your timeline, but wasn't there something where I'm pretty sure Edith Wharton and Henry James were representing the Dreyfus affair? Or
Oh,
there was something I thought in like the early 20th. or maybe now we're like talking 1920s. Anyone out there, they could look it up. But I'm pretty sure there was
Yeah.
something called the Dreyfus Affair, which was
Yeah, I think that
about
was
Jewish
earlier.
immigration earlier, right?
Yeah, that was actually where. So that was in France, where a a French soldier was accused of betraying the French during. I believe it was during the Franco-Prussian War. It might have even been in like the late 1800s. I got to look it up. But he was falsely accused just because he was Jewish of selling out the French nation, and then the writer Emile Zola like came to his defense, and he was found guilty, and I think he was sentenced to like Devil's Island or something, and then Emile Zola like raised a hue and cry, and then that was eventually reversed, and he was set free. But it brought to light sort of the shameful anti-Semitism of French society of that period.
Yeah. Well, and like even with Emma Lazarus, I mean, I remember, advocated Zionism and like kind of believed in Israel before it was the homeland or thinking around a homeland that you even draw in Hotel Cuba. You've already brought this up, but to have you expand on it, that
Mhm.
it's not like all Jewish people, you know, necessarily believed the same when it came to immigrants. Like, I mean, the German Jews, I mean, Emma Lazarus was Sephardic, but like her ancestry differed from German Jewish ancestry. Like Otto Hermann Kahn, who he's um was actually used as the Monopoly Man. Like that's where the Monopoly Man is based off of his, German banking. And he
Mhm.
then has his mansion built on Long Island. That there's so much um going on around the Jewish culture. And, not just because you're Jewish does everyone agree with each other. And a lot of it is that intersectionality you've talked about, like gender, social class, the society they're trying to be part of, right? I think of the House of Mirth with that. And, can you be part of the in group? And, how did you deal with those aspects in Hotel Cuba? Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I hope you're enjoying what you're watching on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So to watch the rest of the episode, head to our Patreon. It is patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. That's Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And you can watch the rest of the episode on our $5 a month membership called ITBR Student, or join the ITBR Professor membership. It's only $10 a month. You get access to all of our videos. You get access to both of our book clubs, the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and the True Crime and Academia book club. Plus, you unlock all of our other episodes. So at the ITBR Student, you only get access to our weekly interviews and the True Crime and Academia episodes. For $10 a month, you get access to our ITBR rewatches, our Teaches series, and True Crime and Academia rewatches and Teaches series, plus the book clubs. Okay, can't wait to see you all on Patreon. And just a reminder, I also offer consultation services. It is $30 for your initial consultation. You get a 1 hour private Zoom with me, and I will help you whether you want to create your own podcast and or media brand, you want to navigate academia as an undergrad or grad student, you need help with technology as it relates to teaching or media. Do you want to expand your social media presence as an artist, writer, podcaster, or academic, or even crafting your public humanities identity? I will help you with my consultation services. You can also find that on Patreon as well. Okay. Thank you all for watching and for supporting the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Bye.